Hello everybody, I'm back, and with my first proper video, no less. Today I want to tell you the story of a mandible and a femur, and in the process explain some of the different ideas about how the last common ancestor between us and chimpanzees may have moved. It's an interesting story, and one that led me down a couple of rabbit holes I wasn't expecting. So, to preface this, a few weeks ago, I want to say March 4th, probably, don't quote me on that though, a new paper was published in Paleobiodiversity and Paleoenvironments, which is one of the journals under the ownership of Springer Nature, which is kind of one of the evil giant corporate behemoths when it comes to scientific publishing. But they own Nature and a whole bunch of other smaller journals as well. This paper was a description of a femur, a partial femur, from the Asmaka quarry in central eastern Bulgaria. Asmaka has late Miocene deposits, specifically from a chunk of the Miocene called the Mycenian, which is the last age of the Miocene and spans about 7.24-ish million years ago to about 5.33 million years ago. So this is right at the tail end of the Miocene. Previously, in 2012, a tooth, it was a maxillary premolar, was found in the quarry that was eventually, through morphologic comparison, identified as belonging to a species of ape called Graecopithecus freibergii. Now, if you're hearing that and thinking to yourself, what? An ape premolar from Bulgaria of all places? That's kind of weird. You're not crazy. When most people think about apes, well, first of all, they don't immediately think of humans. You're probably imagining chimps, gorillas, orangutans, maybe gibbons. But humans are apes, and obviously we have a global distribution. There are humans in Europe, so maybe finding an ape tooth there isn't super surprising. But if you're just thinking about chimps, gorillas, and orangutans, then these are very tropical species, right? They're clustered around the equator in this really thin strip. And Europe is anything but equatorial. It's quite far north. And modern-day Bulgaria isn't exactly an environment you associate with apes. The Miocene is what we call an epoch, which is to say a chunk of geologic time that's shorter than a period and longer than an age. Periods are made up of epochs, and epochs are made up of ages. So the Miocene, the epoch, spans from about 23 million years ago to about 5.3 million years ago, more or less, and forms the first epoch of the Neogene period. The Miocene's claim to fame, and the reason that I and many others think that it is by far the best epoch of the Neogene, is that it is just filled to the brim with apes. During this period of time, catarrhine diversity was essentially flipped relative to how it is now. The old world monkeys, the Graecopithecus, were few and far between, while the apes, on the other hand, the hominoids, were just everywhere. And I mean literally everywhere. In Afro-Eurasia, at least, including Europe. And it's also during the Miocene that we see the differentiation of all of the major groups of apes that are still around today. Now, the focus of this video is going to be on just one of these apes, one that existed right near the end of the Miocene epoch. As I said, the site in question, Asmaka Quarry, harbors fossils from the early Mycenian age, the final age of the Miocene. And it was from these deposits, which are around 7.2 million years old, that our femur was recovered. It quickly became clear to the researchers involved that the femur belonged to a great ape, a hominid, and almost certainly to an African great ape, a hominine. Now, I should pause here and explain these two terms. Hominid refers to any member of the family Hominidae, so this is all the great apes. Orangutans, gorillas, chimps, bonobos, and us. Hominine is a bit more specific, referring just to members of the subfamily Homininae. These are just the African apes, just gorillas, chimps, bonobos, and humans. Hominines can be contrasted with pongins, members of the subfamily Ponginae, which today only includes the 3 extant species of orangutan. More specific still is a term that is going to pop up in almost every video I make on this channel, hominin. Hominins are any species that fall on our line, the human line, after we split from our closest living relatives, the chimps and bonobos. We are the only hominins left, but they used to be quite diverse. So any fossil species more closely related to us than it is to a chimp is a hominin. This can be contrasted with the term panin, which refers to chimps, bonobos, and their extinct relatives, of which we have found practically none, unfortunately. And one final term you should know is hominoid. This is the biggest grouping here. Hominoids are members of the superfamily Hominoidea. better known as apes. We already covered the hominids, the great apes, but there's one other group within Hominoidea, the hylobatids, the gibbons, members of the family Hylobatidae. Now, it's really unfortunate that all of these terms sound practically the same. I mean, they all start with an H, and most of them start with an HOM. So they can be very confusing, but if you need to, come back to this part of the video and review. All right, moving forward. Given that the only other ape taxon found at the Asmaka site was Graecopithecus, based on that tooth I mentioned previously, and for one other reason that I will get into shortly, they assigned the femur to Graecopithecus as well. However, before I continue with this femur, we need to pivot subjects and talk a little bit about the initial discovery and naming of Graecopithecus. And to do that, we need to rewind the clock about 80 years. Now, based on the name, if you had to guess where the first Graecopithecus material was initially discovered, I think you'd probably say Greece. And you'd be right. In 1944, Greece was under Nazi occupation. The Italian army had tried and failed to invade and conquer the region, forcing Hitler to jump into the fray in 1941. During the occupation, a military geologist named Bruno von Freiberg was sent to Greece to oversee the construction of various bunkers and anti-aircraft emplacements. During the construction of one of these bunkers, at a place called Pyrgos Vasilissis, and I'm sure I completely butchered that name because I do not speak Greek, but it's also called the Queen's Tower, in Athens, a group of German soldiers working under Freiberg's supervision accidentally unearthed early Messinian fossiliferous deposits. Among the fossils they recovered was a mandible. Freiberg, believing it to be some kind of Cercopithecid, assigned the fossil to the genus Mesopithecus, an early colobine widespread in Eurasia. He packaged it up and sent it to Berlin to be studied further. However, unfortunately, after its arrival, it was severely damaged by Allied bombing campaigns targeting the city, destroying much of the precious information that otherwise might have been pulled from the teeth. And there it sat for 21 years. Just another Mesopithecus fossil, and a quite damaged one at that. Interesting, to be sure, but not particularly important. But then, in 1972, the fossil was re-examined by one Gustav Heinrich Ralph von Königswald. And again, I'm sure I also completely butchered that name, because I don't speak German. Now, Königswald was a very prolific paleoanthropologist of his time. He's known for a lot of things. Most famously, he did the initial description of Gigantopithecus, and he also did a lot of very important work on Homo erectus. And actually, he was briefly held as a prisoner by the Japanese during World War II. He has a fascinating story, and I'd love to dig into it sometime, but not right now. Upon his examination, Königswald realized that this was definitely not Mesopithecus, and instead, he positively identified it as belonging to some kind of great ape. He renamed the specimen Graecopithecus freibergi after its location of discovery and its initial describer. But again, what actually are these apes doing in Europe? Why are they there? It was known at this time that throughout much of the Miocene, Europe had been home to a massive radiation of great apes, usually referred to as the Dryopithecines. This group was named, unsurprisingly, after Dryopithecus, the earliest of these apes to be formally described. But there is tons of them, so many different genera. But then again, why? Why were they there, right? The answer, which hopefully this doesn't shock you, is climatic differences. The Miocene climate follows a slow up and then down trajectory. Things warm up through the early Miocene, reach their peak in the middle Miocene, and then begin to cool back down towards the end. Most of the Dryopithecines lived during the middle Miocene, in a period called the Middle Miocene Climatic Optimum, the MMCO. On average, the world was about 3 degrees Celsius warmer than it is today. That is quite warm. This warm, wet climate allowed for forests to stretch way further north and south of the equator than they previously did, slowly covering much of the world. Forests persisted across much of the Arctic and even grew in Antarctica. Europe was covered completely in warm, humid, temperate forests. Apes thrived in these conditions, radiating into Europe and diversifying into a truly massive array of forms. Where exactly the Dryopithecines fall phylogenetically is controversial. There are 3 viable hypotheses, but the consensus on which is most likely to be valid is currently in flux, and probably will be for a long time. One position, based on postcranial material found from several taxa, mostly in Spain, claims they were stempongians, which is to say, very early diverging members of the lineage that would eventually yield orangutans. Biogeography also superficially supports this hypothesis, with the idea being that the Dryopithecine-Pongian common ancestor lived somewhere in the Middle East, and then one branch moved west into Europe, while the other moved east into Asia. This, however, is definitely a minority position. More commonly, it's been suggested that the Dryopithecines are more closely related to today's hominines, the African apes, than they are to orangutans. Various aspects of the premaxilla, the sinuses, the frontal bone, and some aspects of the teeth point us in this direction. This has been championed by David Begun, who is kind of a big name in the study of Miocene apes. His book, The Real Planet of the Apes, covers many aspects of this hypothesis. Rising to tangle with this sort of paraphyletic stem hominine hypothesis is the stem hominid hypothesis, which places most of the Dryopithecines, with the exception of 3, which we'll look at in a moment, outside of the Ponginae-Homininae split. This position can be summed up by the work of Kelsey Pugh with this beautiful phylogeny. Pugh's work puts the Dryopithecines as a paraphyletic grouping on the stem of Hominidae. However, in Pugh's assessment, a specific trio of late Miocene European and Anatolian apes, represented by Graecopithecus, and the 2 species of Organopithecus, one of which, Organopithecus turcae, has been recently reclassified as Anadiluvius turcae, due to they found essentially more cranial material for it and realized it was different enough to become its own genus. In Pugh's assessment, these do still shake out as hominines. In both models, this triad is firmly established as part of Homininae, though whether it is on the stem or within the crown group is debated. Central to this debate is the question of biogeography. Under the stem hominine model, the ancestors of today's hominines left Africa and entered Europe, where they progressively evolved traits we see in modern African apes, before then dispersing back south into Africa in the late Miocene, giving rise to the gorilla, chimp, and human lines. This hypothesis is bolstered by the fact that we have yet to find any convincing fossils in Africa from this time period that bear much resemblance to hominines. That is, with the possible exceptions of Graecopithecus and Chiroropithecus, which some propose to be gorillans, but these texts are both super fragmentary, really just a couple of teeth, and they're very controversial. On the one hand, we do seem to see most of the traits, particularly cranial traits, associated with hominines emerge over time among the Dryopithecines, and we do not see that in Africa. On the other hand, large parts of Africa, particularly tropical forest regions, are quite underrepresented in the fossil record due to both preservation bias and the difficulty of retrieving fossil materials from remote places in rural regions. The truth is murky, and both sides have made some pretty convincing arguments. I tend to err on the Dryopithecines as hominines side of things personally, but that may just be because I've read David Begun's book, right? He's the first person who really started pushing for this idea, and it was the first of these hypotheses that I really investigated the literature on myself, anchoring bias and all. And I'll link to a few interviews with Begun and some of his work, as well as some of the other published work that's at odds with his ideas in the description. This video isn't the place to dig into it super deeply, though I would at some point like to make a deep dive on hominine ancestry. Regardless of which model you follow, Graecopithecus shakes out as being a member of Homininae. This is pretty unambiguously an African ape in Greece. And so, returning specifically to our Graecopithecus material, in 2017, a group that included David Begun published a very controversial study, alleging, on the basis of what little information could be pulled from the teeth, that Graecopithecus may in fact be a hominin. I remember when I first started becoming interested in paleoanthro a few years ago, I would frequent the List of Human Evolution Fossils Wikipedia page, and sure enough, Graecopithecus was listed there. And I remember being disappointed by how thin the actual evidence was upon further investigation. The crux of their argument was that the root morphology of the canine and fourth premolar were more hominin-like than anything else. On this basis, they proposed, tentatively, I don't want to make it seem like they were saying Graecopithecus is for sure a hominin. They weren't. They said it has possible hominin affinities. But they proposed that Graecopithecus could be the earliest hominin. Most people were very skeptical, and rightfully so. But now, almost a decade later, we have this femur, which does clearly show some signals of bipedality. The femur itself is incomplete, consisting of the proximal end through to the distal metaphysis. It's got this beautiful, patchy, cracked black and gold tan appearance. It's a product of its unique taphonomy, but it's like honestly pretty stunning to look at. But regardless, if we're trying to identify bipedality in a fossil, there's a certain suite of characteristics we can look for, specifically in the femur. The most diagnostic of these have to do with the femoral neck and the distribution of cortical bone around it, and also the angle of the knee. Humans have what's called a valgus knee, which means essentially that the femur connects with the tibia at an angle, bends inward, and the shaft of the femur travels laterally up. This helps us balance our weight over our ankles, helping make our continuous bipedalism possible. It's partially the elongation of the femoral neck which makes this valgus angle possible, by pushing the top of the femur outwards away from the body. Combined with that, the lengthening of the femoral neck also helps with shock absorption. We're putting a lot more stress on our femurs when we walk than something like a chimp because we're constantly crashing down our entire weight on them, whereas a chimp is putting comparatively way less force on the neck. And then that cortical bone distribution. Right? That's the tough, thicker, denser outer layer of bone. And we can kind of clock bipedalism in the fossil record by looking at how it's distributed around the femoral neck. So bone is not a static tissue, right? It's alive, just like any other tissue in your body, and it undergoes constant maintenance. Bone is constantly being resorbed and laid back down and repaired and all that good stuff. One of the most incredible properties of bone is bone remodeling. Bone can adapt and strengthen or weaken depending on the stresses and loads that are placed on it. In bones that are consistently under a lot of stress, more bone will be laid down to thicken and strengthen them. When bones are not frequently used, they will weaken and thin. It's the same concept as with your muscles, right? If you don't exercise a muscle, it'll atrophy. And if you do, it'll strengthen and get larger. This is called Wolff's Law. It's named after this guy, Julius Wolff. He was a German surgeon, I believe, or something like that, in the 1800s. But because of this, when you look at someone's bones, you can kind of tell what biomechanical stressors they were under. So if you compared the femur of a runner to the femur of a mostly sedentary office worker, the runner is going to have a thicker and more robust femur. Similarly, a human is going to have a very different distribution of a cortical bone on the femur than a chimp, because we're using our legs in different ways. And you can see this when you actually look at the bones. Right, so if you look at the image I've got up now, you can see that in a human, the cortical bone is asymmetrically distributed towards the bottom of the image, whereas in the chimp, the distribution is overall more even. Now, this is a figure from the paper that I'm currently talking about, and I'm obscuring half of it right now, because when I show you the full thing, this is what you'll see. Now, note that H is our Asmaka femur, and J is the femur of Mesopithecus. H immediately jumps out as being more similar to the human than to either the chimp or Mesopithecus. Moreover, the overall length of the femoral neck is longer than we tend to find in non-human African apes. In the words of the authors, in many features, the Asmaka femur is most similar to hominins, especially early hominins. The main metrical features linking the Asmaka femur with the hominins, in parentheses bipeds, relate to the various manifestations of the elongation of the femoral neck. This elongation has a functional import and represents a diagnostic trait of bipedal walking. And as I read through this paper and got through more and more aspects of the femoral minutiae, an interesting pattern kind of emerged. Over and over, it seems that this femur is most similar to the femur of Auroran tucanensis, or, in general, genus Australopithecus. This happens over and over again. The fovea capitis, the neck shaft angle, the overall neck shape, the curvature of the shaft, right? Certain muscle attachment sites like the gluteal tuberosity or the linea aspera. I forget the third one they talk about. I think it's the lateral pilaster or something like that. The Asmaka femur, again and again, seems to be most similar to Auroran and Australopithecus. There are some signals that pull it in another direction. For example, the size and shape of the greater trochanter is more similar to Dryopithecus and modern chimps. But by and large, a lot of the morphology of this thing does seem to be pulling it in a hominin-like direction. Now, if we look at these PCAs that they have here in the paper, PCA is a principal component analysis. It's basically just a fancy graph that mathematically combines various traits that would normally occupy multiple axes into two axes so that you can actually display them in a way that's feasible to understand. You can use these to see how a bone or something like that compares when all of its features are combined to other bones, and how different points cluster can tell you about relationships between them. So here they draw a shape that's occupied by all the human femurs they sampled, a shape for all the gorilla femurs they sampled, all the chimp femurs, etc., etc. And then they threw in a few fossil femurs as well to see where they fall. Unsurprisingly, Australopithecus afarensis and Paranthropus group closest with modern humans, while the Asmaka femur generally groups within the Pantroglodytes cluster, the chimp shape space, alongside, funnily enough, Auroran, which it sits quite close to. But both of them are close to the edge and could feasibly form their own hominin biped shape space in the bottom right corner that slightly overlaps with the chimp region if you connected them all up. And then here we have another PCA, this time dividing the groups up based on locomotion, right? You've got your suspensory group, you've got your knuckle walker group, and you've got your bipedal group. And again, you can see Asmaka falls right on the edge between the knuckle walkers and the bipeds in terms of femur morphology. And then in this last graph here, we can see that, again, Asmaka falls right between knuckle walkers and bipeds, though this time it's definitely a little more biased towards the biped side of things. So again and again, in both measurements of single features and in these big combined analyses, we see this femur grouping with Auroran, which is incredibly interesting, and means I should probably briefly talk about Auroran. Auroran tugenensis was the name given in 2001 to a bunch of different little fossils, a series of femoral fragments, a smattering of teeth, a partial mandible, a little bit of a humerus, and a single first distal phalanx from a hand. So that's the last bone of your thumb. You should also note that a separate mandible, now assigned to a second species of Auroran praegens, was initially described by none other than Walter Ferguson, who you might remember from the last video, as a subspecies of his nonsense taxon Homo antiquus, which is, of course, the namesake of this channel. Ferguson, working with some actual paleoanthropologists, referred to the mandibular fossil, plus some other unrelated material, as a subspecies of Homo antiquus, specifically Homo antiquus praegens. Later reanalysis dropped the Homo antiquus, but kept the praegens. The important thing about Auroran, for our purposes, is those femoral fragments. Specifically, one of them, called BAR 1002'00, which is a mouthful, so we'll just call it the Auroran femur for now on. This is usually what people are talking about when you hear about Auroran, because it's by far the most diagnostic material we have for the taxon. Similarly to Asmaka, Auroran was argued to be a hominin mainly on the basis of this femur, which has a long neck, large head, and cortical bone distribution that indicates habitual bipedalism. Importantly, the oldest Auroran material is about 6 million years old. Auroran is generally accepted by most to be a hominin, though not all, there are always exceptions. And this is on the basis of quite a few of the same arguments currently being made for the Asmaka femur. The main difference here is that the Asmaka femur is, at least compared to Auroran, beat to absolute hell. The Auroran femur is remarkably well preserved, and that allows for really detailed analysis of the various muscle attachment sites on the bone and just tiny details like that. This is a lot harder with Asmaka. And despite their attempts to identify a gluteal tuberosity, linea aspera, etc., what they're seeing could also just be the product of post-depositional deformation of one form or another. And this femur's all cracked, and it could be warped in other ways too. And there's something else at play here. It's undeniable that this femur looks like it belonged to something that was at least bipedal semi-regularly. But we have to ask the question, does the presence of bipedalism in a fossil hominin necessarily mean that it was a hominin? This is quite honestly the big question in the study of early hominins right now. How did our common ancestor with the pannins move? For a long time, it was assumed that that last common ancestor must have been a knuckle walker, right? Because, after all, both chimps and gorillas are knuckle walkers, so from their perspective of parsimony, it makes a lot of sense to assume that the common ancestor of all hominines was a knuckle walker as well, and that chimps and gorillas maintained the ancestral condition while human bipedalism was a novel adaptation. I think there's definitely also a little bit of human exceptionalism going on here. It's the assumption that our common ancestor must have been more chimp-like because, humans are so much more evolved than those other primitive apes. So obviously our common ancestor was more chimp-like than human-like. This narrative started to crack after the description of Ardipithecus ramidus at 4.4 million years old and still very clearly a biped. People were a little confused. They were like, at this point, this far back, we should be seeing some aspects of knuckle walking. And it was further hampered by the bipedality found in Auroran and Sahelanthropus, which more on Sahelanthropus in a moment. I know there's controversy there, but this pushed our evidence of bipedality back to around 7 million years ago, right around the proposed date of that last common ancestor. If bipedality in humans evolved from a knuckle-walking ancestor, then one would assume we would find evidence of that transition in the fossil record. And we don't. Mostly. And I'll explain what I mean by that shortly. But because of this, a new possibility was proposed. What if the last common ancestor wasn't particularly chimp-like in its locomotion? What if instead, chimps and gorillas both independently evolved knuckle walking, and the human and chimp common ancestor was a more generalized suspensory climber? This idea found support in developmental studies of the wrist and hand of both chimps and gorillas, and also various biomechanical studies, which all indicated that knuckle walking in these two groups was a result of homoplasy. In other words, convergent evolution. Additionally, many of the features of the digits that are commonly associated with knuckle walking in chimps and gorillas, and you can expand that even out to a lot of aspects of the wrist and the forearm, are also found in primate species that don't knuckle walk and can also be seen as adaptations towards vertical climbing, meaning that a lot of aspects of the human wrist and fingers that were previously described as vestiges of our knuckle walking past could be reinterpreted as vestiges of an arboreal past. Many began proposing that a highly arboreal creature, perhaps having a locomotor style similar to that of Danuvius, a middle Miocene ape from Germany that lumps with the Graecopithecines, was likely the condition of the common ancestor. Danuvius is weird. It probably had a very strange form of movement that's often referred to as ELC, or extended limb clambering. It's basically proposed to have walked upright along the branches while using its arms to stabilize itself from above and pull itself along, kind of a form of arboreal bipedalism. And as with everything in this field, Danuvius's locomotor style is disputed. But if it truly was an arboreal biped, it may be a decent model for what the human-chimp last common ancestor may have moved like. Importantly, Danuvius is specifically noted as having likely used its arms and legs in equal proportion. Now, imagine an upright ELC user in the trees in a cooling climate in the late Miocene, where trees are becoming more and more sparse and sprawling savannas are spreading out, separating patchy woodlands by vast strands of grass. As the trees slowly start to disappear, the very first population of apes on our side of the split is forced to spend more and more time on the ground. A creature that's mainly bipedal in the trees, without trees, is going to be mainly bipedal on the ground. And then from that point, selection takes over, and more efficient forms of terrestrial bipedalism are developed until you reach something like Homo erectus. That is an obligate biped that has almost completely left the trees behind. But this does leave one major question. If this is the case, then why on earth did the chimp line develop knuckle walking from an arboreal biped ancestor? What on earth would drive selection for that? And why wouldn't they just become more efficient bipeds like us as well, right? The only thing that I can think of is that, like I said, the Danuvius paper specifically mentions that Danuvius was probably using its upper and lower limbs in equal proportion for its movement. Right? Those upper limbs are still doing quite a bit of work to pull it along as it pushes off with its lower limbs. Maybe the first difference to show up between the hominin and panin lines was a shift in limb dominance. Maybe, for whatever reason, the hominin line, while still almost completely arboreal, lost this equal proportion of limb use and started relying just a little bit more on the lower limbs. Early panins, on the other hand, perhaps they didn't lose this distribution and maintained the equal contribution from both the fore and hind limbs to locomotion. Then, as the trees became more sparse and they're forced into a more terrestrial lifestyle, they still need to use their forelimbs to help pull themselves along the ground, eventually leading to knuckle walking. Whereas in our line, since we've become more hind limb dominant for moving around, we just went the biped route on the ground. Now, I should be very clear here. I'm completely just speculating right now. What I just said isn't based on anything I've read in the literature, specifically about the limb dominance. All the other stuff is, but it's just an idea that makes intuitive sense to me. And to be even more clear, no one is proposing that Danuvius is a hominin. Nobody's saying that. Or that it's the last common ancestor between humans and chimps. It lived 11.6 million years ago in Germany. That's even prior to the oldest estimates for the human and gorilla divergence, let alone the human-chimp divergence. It's safely outside of crown homininae. But people have pointed to it as a proxy for what the last common ancestor may have moved like. This is a very elegant hypothesis overall. I really like it. And it would mean that using evidence of bipedalism in a fossil wouldn't necessarily be the best diagnostic tool for determining whether or not a given species is a hominin, right? If bipedalism, at least arboreal bipedalism, is older than the chimp-human split, all of a sudden, bipedalism is no longer necessarily indicative of hominin status. So, working under this model, the Asmaka femur would still be a bit of a mystery. Yes, it probably belonged to a semi-regular biped of some kind, but not necessarily a hominin. And beyond this, when we say that something is bipedal and therefore it must be a hominin, we're also making a very different assumption. We're essentially saying that terrestrial bipedalism is so vanishingly rare, evolutionarily speaking, specifically when it comes to apes, that therefore any bipedal ape we find must be some kind of hominin, which this assumption makes us effectively blind to homoplasy. We have to also consider the possibility that the bipedal traits exhibited by this femur may be completely unrelated to hominin bipedalism. Perhaps Graecopithecus is a stem hominin, or maybe a relative of Danuvius that underwent a similar process as to what I described above. There's a lot of possibilities, and we have to stay open to them all. Even that model I just proposed above for the evolution of hominin bipedality is astronomically far from being universally agreed upon. Right? When you look at something like Sahelanthropus and the postcranial material that was just recently described in the past few years, on first pass, it seems to fit this model quite well. It's got an anteriorly shifted foramen magnum, indicating an upright posture. It's got a femur with some faint, but certainly present indications of at least occasional bipedalism. And it's got ulnae that look nicely adapted for suspensory clambering. If we take knuckle walking to be a case of homoplasy, then a suspensory, highly orthograde ape, maybe even engaging in some kind of perhaps arboreal bipedality, like ELC, for example, with small canines, is honestly the perfect candidate for a hominin before the development of full-on terrestrial bipedalism. And that would be such a lovely and concise explanation if it wasn't for this paper called Earliest Evidence of Hominin Bipedalism in Sahelanthropus chidensis, which is claiming on the basis of the two Sahelanthropus ulnae that it has some adaptations that indicate knuckle walking, at least some of the time. Right, so this is a whole mess, right? They're saying it's got some knuckle walking behaviors, probably mixed with bipedality. And Sahelanthropus is actually a good point of comparison here, as the Asmaka femur is more or less the same age, about 7 million years old. And, they actually note something which I hadn't heard before. And this is definitely a bit of a tangent, but I think it's one worth going on. There are a few specific features in the femur that they talk about, which I think kind of help to ground us in a way and make us remember that these bones aren't just mathematical abstractions to be measured and compared. They were the bones of real individuals. What they point out is that the region of the Sahelanthropus femur that would have contained the gluteal tuberosity, if it had one, right? We don't know because this area is so damaged, but it seems to have been gnawed away by rodents. This is far from surprising. It's a creature that died. Obviously, something else is going to try and munch on it. But it's just one of those tidbits that makes you remember that this animal that we call Tumai It was real, lived and loved and died. It makes you feel that a little bit more, I guess. This was a real living animal that died millions of years ago and lived a rich, wonderful, terrible, amazing, horrible, every adjective you can think of, life. Regardless, the authors have this to say about Sahelanthropus. Without the presence of the features characteristic of the proximal femur of hominins, it's difficult to compare Sahelanthropus with the Asmaka femur. But the Asmaka femur does not show, as noted, features that represent significant indications of arboreality. Considering the aforementioned morpho-functional features of the Asmaka femur, we conclude that the Asmaka hominin was at least as much, but most probably more strongly adapted to a bipedal lifestyle than Sahelanthropus, although we cannot speak of habitual bipedalism. They specify here that there are no significant indications of arboreal activity on the Asmaka femur, but we have to keep in mind that all we're looking at right now is the top 3/4 of a femur. That's it. While the most diagnostic traits for arboreality would likely be found in the forelimbs, not the hind limbs. Interestingly, they also note that the femur has several attributes that align with terrestrial quadrupedality, as opposed to bipedality. And it should be noted that the authors here imply that their position is that knuckle walking was likely ancestral for hominins. This is hardly surprising, given that David Begun is on the paper. He is very much a proponent of the knuckle walking ancestor hypothesis. But in my admittedly very limited understanding of things, as I kind of hinted at earlier, most of the purported evidence in the hand and wrist and arm morphology shared by humans and chimps and gorillas that are sometimes cited as being signs of knuckle-walking ancestors are both present in other primates that are not knuckle walkers and could be instead interpreted as adaptations for vertically climbing thick branches and tree trunks, as both chimps and gorillas are known to do. But then again, there's that Sahelanthropus paper, the one I just mentioned, that supposedly found signals associated with knuckle walking in the ulnae. Point is, it's an open question. And all of this is confounded by the fact that our current molecular clock estimates, at least based on last year's complete ape genomes paper, place the common ancestor of humans and chimps as living between 6.3 and 5.5 million years ago. Both Sahelanthropus and Graecopithecus fall out of that range by almost 1 million years. Now, again, I don't really know exactly how reliable molecular clock dating is. It seems like paleontologists and molecular biologists tend to disagree on its efficacy and precision. See the whole initial primate divergence time fiasco. But my current understanding is that it's kind of all over the place. Sometimes. But that usually if you properly account for generation time and use mutation rates found in unconstrained regions of the genome, it can be pretty darn accurate. So then, was Graecopithecus a hominin? That's the main question of this video. Maybe even the first hominin? Well, maybe. It's certainly possible, but also maybe not. What we can say confidently is that this femur does seem to show an animal that frequently walks upright on 2 legs on the ground. And that's pretty damn cool. Furthermore, paleoenvironmental work on the Asmaka site has revealed that Bulgaria during this period was something of a seasonal dry, wet savanna environment, and one that was actively drying out no less. The late Miocene was a time of general global cooling, and this cooling coincided with general aridification and the drying out of the landscape, which in turn caused forests to contract southwards, the opposite of what happened in the Middle Miocene. This aridification, coupled with tectonic forces far to the west, would, in the next 2 million years, actually completely dry up the Mediterranean Sea in what's known as the Messinian salinity crisis, which absolutely deserves its own video, because it's a crazy story. But the verdant European forests that the Dryopithecines had occupied for so long were disappearing. For some, this meant extinction, but for others, it meant migration south. And for others still, clearly it meant a shift in how they moved around. Regardless of whether or not you think Graecopithecus is a hominin, or if its bipedality is homologous to ours or not, maybe just a case of homoplasy, it was this open, patchy woodland savanna environment that encouraged it. Quite honestly, more than either of our hypothetical early hominin femurs, both of which are sending confusing and conflicting signals, the evidence from the canines in both Sahelanthropus and Graecopithecus is more striking to me. Small canines are a hallmark of hominins. One of the main features that separates us from other apes is our small canines and lack of a CP3 honing complex. And that is a system between the jaws wherein the upper canine rubs against the lower third premolar, helping to sharpen it and keep it looking menacing. It's essentially, they rub together and it hones the canine. And this is present in all other apes that we know of. And pretty much all simiiform primates, strepsirrhines are their own deal, but all simiiforms have these really big canines, and it's really rare for them to be super reduced, like in humans. The only other example I can think of right now, and I'm probably missing something, but is TT monkeys. They have very, very small canines. But the point is, this is a very rare thing, and it's very diagnostic of hominin status. For Graecopithecus, it's really hard to say anything definitive because the original mandible was so heavily damaged during World War II. But the canine roots do apparently appear consistent with a somewhat small canine. Furthermore, there are two other genera that are believed to be quite closely related to Graecopithecus that I mentioned earlier. They're from this region in the same time period, those being Oranopithecus and Antediluvius. The former is found in Macedonia and the latter in Anatolia. I think they're a little bit older, but around the same time. All of these genera are proposed to have somewhat reduced canine teeth. And the team from our paper here seems to imply that these two taxa are potentially ancestral to Graecopithecus, but outside of the human-chimp split. The exact position they're taking is a little unclear to me. They write, "We suggest that the likely ancestors of Graecopithecus, the taxon to which FM349AZM6, that's the Asmaka femur, is most parsimoniously attributed to, which are widely regarded as hominine, were already partly terrestrial. These putative ancestors, including Oranopithecus and Antediluvius, are associated with a sparsely forested to grassland habitat. Two phalanges are known from Oranopithecus and are suggestive of a positional behavior dominated by terrestriality. As the habitat became more open, selection favored a more diverse positional repertoire that included bipedalism. We can only speculate on the precise nature of this selection." End quote. In Sahelanthropus, the canine is particularly small. And when you consider the fact that Tumai, which is the name of our Sahelanthropus cranium, was most likely a male based on the super prominent brow ridge, the tiny size of the canine and the apparent lack of a CP3 honing complex is even more notable. And for me, this pushes Sahelanthropus into the likely hominin camp. So, in the end, what we have here is two viable candidates that seem to vaguely fit the bill for the two different models of how hominin bipedal locomotion evolved. One that purports to show a transition from terrestrial quadrupedalism to terrestrial bipedalism, represented by Graecopithecus, and one that seems to possibly show a transition from orthograde arboreal suspension to terrestrial bipedalism, represented by Sahelanthropus. This is frustrating and fascinating in equal parts. Personally, for now, I'm not super willing to say Graecopithecus is a hominin, and I am more comfortable with Sahelanthropus. The material is better, it's more complete, and it tells a story that seems to be more consistent with what has been recently established. Now, that's not to say that Sahelanthropus is in any way like a complete specimen. It's, the skull is basically exploded and the femur is fragmentary, but it's still more material than Graecopithecus. Now, if the Asmaka femur really was from a biped, which it probably was, we have to keep in mind that it could be just another example of hominid homoplasy. One last thing I should note, and this is something I've neglected to mention thus far because it's kind of dominating the conversation everywhere else, and quite honestly, it's one of the less interesting parts of the story, in my opinion. But as previously mentioned, the Asmaka quarry is in Bulgaria, which is part of Europe, which means that if it is a hominin, then potentially the human-chimp split might have happened in southern Europe or potentially Anatolia. This has already been spun by various internet racists into this weird, win for European identity or something like that. Or by some, they're somehow trying to take it as evidence that Europeans and Africans somehow don't share common ancestry. Stupid stuff like that. Things that are just completely made up junk peddled by race realists and those who want to bring back eugenics. But also, some people do tend to have a real knee-jerk reaction to the suggestion that any part of the human evolutionary tale might have occurred outside of the modern geographical bounds of Africa, as if even suggesting as much is somehow indicative of a deep-seated racism or something like that. And that's ridiculous. These things happened wherever they happened, and we shouldn't need to attach any political weight to them. That's just plain stupid, to be honest. So far, I'm not convinced that the earliest hominins were Balkan, but, it's certainly possible. And this isn't bad evidence for that idea. The point is, I don't care beyond general curiosity where the human and chimp common ancestor lived, and neither should you. But, to be clear, this has no effect on the out-of-Africa theory, which is about as well supported as any hypothesis can be from just about every possible avenue. But that theory only has to do with modern Homo sapiens. It has nothing to do with the origins of hominins. So, to close this out, if this femur does belong to Graecopithecus, which it probably does, it is definitely an interesting contender for an early hominin. The authors put it better than I ever could when they wrote, "Our analysis reveals, instead, a unique transitional locomotor repertoire, combining an early form of facultative bipedalism with terrestrial quadrupedalism, with biomechanical differences from later bipeds. We propose that bipedalism in the latest Miocene of the Balkans evolved in an open landscape setting from quadrupedal terrestrial ancestors, and that the Asmaka hominine represents a candidate for the ancestral form of positional behavior from which habitual and obligate bipedalism, documented in later hominins, evolved." At the end of the day, Graecopithecus is just far too fragmentary to say anything super definitive. Perhaps there's just something about the ancestral hominine body plan that lends itself to a terrestrial fork in the road, a shift to either bipedality or knuckle walking when terrestriality increases and suspension decreases. Maybe. Or maybe hominines were never primarily suspensory to begin with. Maybe knuckle walking is homologous. Who knows? I guess we just have to dig around in the dirt some more and hope against all odds that we unearth the answer. And while it may be a little unsatisfying, that really is the answer to all of this. Maybe. All right. Thank you all for watching, and stay tuned for more.